The courtroom in Fresno, California, had a palpable sense of tension in the air. It wasn't just the oppressive summer heat, but the weight of an impending decision. Every pair of eyes in the room was focused on Judge Malcolm Brewer, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. At 62 years old, with 35 years of experience, Judge Brewer had earned a reputation for being stern, unwavering, and unsentimental. His judgments were as definitive as his chiseled features, shaped over decades of deciding the fate of countless individuals. Today, all eyes were on him as he prepared to hand down a sentence that would alter the life of a young man forever. Ryan Hale, just 24 years old, stood at the defendant's table, his hands slightly trembling but his gaze unwavering. Ryan had lived his life trying to prove that he was more than the sum of his circumstances, more than the world that seemed to label him before he had even spoken. He had always maintained his innocence, even when arrested for the armed robbery of Carter's jewelers, a crime that had left a man critically injured. His mother, seated at the back of the courtroom, held her breath, praying for a miracle. She had done everything she could to show the court that Ryan was more than just the accused. He was a son, a man with dreams, a person worthy of compassion. But in this courtroom, that plea was ignored. The evidence against him seemed too overwhelming to deny. Eyewitness testimonies, grainy surveillance footage, an anonymous tip that led the police directly to Ryan. Despite his insistence that he was innocent and had never even seen a weapon, the case appeared to be solid. The prosecutor painted Ryan as a cold and calculated criminal. The defense team struggled to make headway against the mounting evidence, and the jury found him guilty on all counts. When Judge Brewer delivered the 60-year sentence, it was swift and cold, a sound that reverberated in Ryan's mind like the finality of a tombstone. Ryan didn't flinch as the gavel struck, but his soul was in agony. He turned to glance at his mother, who, despite her valiant attempts to hold back tears, couldn't contain the sorrow on her face. As he was led away in shackles, his mind drifted. It was a sentence that felt like the death of any future he could have had. The trial had been a spectacle. The robbery itself was daring, a masked man storming into Carter's jewelers, brandishing a weapon and fleeing with over $150,000 worth of stolen goods. It left one store clerk, Samuel Gaines, fighting for his life after being struck in the crossfire. Ryan Hale, a part-time mechanic with no criminal record, had been arrested shortly after the robbery. An anonymous tip had led the police to him, claiming Ryan matched the description of the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution's case was solid, or at least that's how it appeared. They connected Ryan to the stolen goods found in a storage unit under his name. Eyewitnesses swore they recognized his voice, and perhaps most damning of all, fingerprints had been found on the weapon left behind at the scene. Despite these overwhelming details, Ryan maintained his innocence, repeating over and over that he had never been near the store, let alone touched a gun. His defense, however, crumbled quickly under cross-examination. Ryan's alibi, that he was working a double shift at the auto shop that day, couldn't be verified. His boss admitted, under oath, that he couldn't recall Ryan's whereabouts for the entire shift. The defense lawyer, an overworked public defender, failed to make a compelling argument, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Brewer, always professional, prepared to deliver the sentence. He had seen men like Ryan before, young men who seemed too naive, too unseasoned to know how to work the system. To Brewer, the case was clear. The facts spoke for themselves, and there was no room for doubt. Ryan was guilty, and justice needed to be served. The gavel came down hard, signaling the end of the trial and the start of Ryan's 60-year prison sentence. But for Judge Brewer, the day didn't end with the ruling. As he signed the papers in his chambers that evening, a faint unease lingered in the back of his mind, a nagging feeling that he couldn't shake off, as if something had been overlooked, a flicker of doubt that he was unwilling to fully acknowledge. He dismissed it. The case had been closed, the evidence was clear, and he had done his job. Or so he thought. The real twist began not in the courtroom, but in the quiet solitude of Judge Brewer's study. That evening, as he sat down to review a new case involving police misconduct, his eyes stumbled upon something that would forever alter his perception of justice. Among the stack of legal briefs, an evidence log from a prior investigation caught his eye. The name listed in the log stood out like a beacon: Ryan Hale. Brewer felt a shiver run down his spine. It couldn't be. He flipped through the file quickly, searching for a connection, but what he found only deepened his concern. The log was from a different case altogether, one unrelated to the robbery that had sent Ryan to prison. But buried within the details was a crucial piece of evidence: a gun. A gun that matched the description of the weapon used in the robbery, but one that had never been presented during Ryan's trial. Brewer felt the weight of the discovery press upon him. The gun, which had been seized 2 days after the robbery in an unrelated investigation, couldn't have been used in the Carter's Jewelers crime. Yet, the evidence had never surfaced, and there was no record of it being entered into the trial proceedings. This wasn't just an oversight. Brewer's gut told him it was something more sinister. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, and the room seemed to grow smaller as the enormity of the situation became apparent. This gun, which was supposedly in police custody during Ryan's trial, couldn't have been the weapon used in the robbery. If it wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints were on it? Brewer's mind raced, and as he pieced together the evidence, one thing became clear. Ryan Hale had been framed. As the days passed and Brewer's investigation deepened, the cracks in the case began to widen. Brewer reached out to retired investigator Daniel Hayes for help. Together, they began to unravel a web of corruption that extended far beyond the courtroom. They uncovered falsified reports, missing evidence, and coerced witness statements, all orchestrated by the same detective who had led the investigation into Ryan's case, Detective Lewis. The more Brewer and Hayes dug, the more disturbing the findings became. A witness who had initially identified someone else as the suspect had later been pressured into changing their statement. And when they tracked down that witness, his story fell apart. The witness confessed that Detective Lewis had threatened him with arrest if he didn't testify against Ryan Hale. It became clear. This wasn't just a botched case. This was a setup. Brewer's stomach churned as he thought about the 60 years he had just sentenced Ryan to, a young man whose entire life was about to be consumed by a crime he didn't commit. Brewer knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this injustice stand, no matter the personal cost. What he had uncovered was just the beginning. There was much more to this story, and the truth was desperate to be exposed. But it would require courage. Courage Brewer hadn't needed for years. The path forward was dangerous, but the pursuit of justice would not be denied. The rabbit hole that Brewer and Hayes were now exploring led them deeper into a system that was rotten at its core. Brewer felt a surge of anger as he learned more about the manipulations and corruption. Detective Lewis, who had been the driving force behind Ryan's wrongful conviction, had a history of questionable behavior. There were multiple reports of intimidation, falsified evidence, and coerced confessions under his watch. His record, however, had remained spotless, protected by layers of bureaucracy that shielded him from any scrutiny. Brewer's resolve grew stronger. He had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The evidence they uncovered was staggering: fabricated reports, missing evidence logs, altered witness statements. It was clear someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Ryan Hale was convicted. It wasn't just an error or oversight. It was a deliberate act of deceit. The breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Lewis's police account. One email stood out above the rest. It was addressed to the district attorney, detailing a plan to ensure Ryan's conviction. The email attached a list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements, all designed to secure a guilty verdict in the case. Brewer's blood ran cold as he read the email. The truth was now undeniable. Ryan Hale had been framed, and the real criminal was a man who had sworn to protect the public. Detective Lewis had been orchestrating the entire case from the shadows. But Brewer knew the path ahead would be treacherous. Lewis had powerful allies within the police department, and exposing this corruption could cost Brewer everything. His career, his reputation, even his safety were on the line. But there was no turning back. Ryan Hale's life had been destroyed, and Brewer would not rest until justice was done. As the investigation progressed, the walls began to close in on Detective Lewis. Brewer's courage in the face of such overwhelming opposition was a testament to his unwavering belief in the law. But he wasn't just fighting for Ryan. He was fighting for the integrity of the justice system itself. The system that he had devoted his life to was deeply flawed, and it was time for it to be confronted. But Brewer wasn't alone. He had allies in Hayes, and he had the undeniable proof of wrongdoing in his hands. With that evidence, they were ready to strike. The first move came when Brewer filed a motion to reopen Ryan's case, attaching the explosive evidence against Detective Lewis. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse, igniting a firestorm of media attention. People began to question everything they thought they knew about the justice system in Fresno. For the first time in years, Brewer felt the heat of public scrutiny. He had become a lightning rod for both praise and condemnation. Some hailed him as a hero, a man of integrity who was willing to risk it all for justice. Others vilified him as a traitor, someone who was undermining the very system he had spent a lifetime serving. Despite the backlash, Brewer remained resolute. He knew the truth had to be exposed, even if it meant facing down his own colleagues, even if it meant becoming a target for those in power who wanted to keep the truth buried. The risks were real. Brewer began receiving anonymous threats. His car tires were slashed and crude notes were left, warning him to back off. But Brewer was undeterred. The truth could not be silenced. The battle was heating up, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Detective Lewis was fighting back. Through his attorney, he denied the allegations, claiming that Brewer's motion was nothing more than a personal vendetta. In a televised interview, Lewis maintained his innocence, presenting himself as the victim of a smear campaign. His polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to the growing body of evidence against him. Brewer watched from his living room, his jaw clenched in frustration. The lies were bold, but Brewer knew that they wouldn't last much longer. The truth was on his side. The next breakthrough came when Hayes tracked down critical security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store, footage that had never been submitted during Ryan's trial. The footage, which had somehow been overlooked or deliberately concealed, showed a man matching Detective Lewis's physical description, leaving the scene of the robbery with a duffel bag. The footage was damning. It not only exonerated Ryan, but also implicated the very man who had led the investigation against him. With this new evidence, Brewer knew the time had come to act. He called for an emergency hearing to present the footage in court. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, the tension palpable as the footage played for the first time. Gasps echoed through the room as the truth became undeniable. Brewer stood before the packed gallery, pointing to the screen and declaring, "This man, the same detective who led the investigation into Ryan Hale, manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The courtroom was stunned. Lewis, sitting in the gallery, was escorted out in handcuffs, his defiant words ringing in the air, "You don't know what you've started." But for Brewer, this was the moment he had been working toward, the moment when the truth was finally revealed. With the new evidence in hand, the case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Ryan's wrongful conviction was under review. Brewer knew that this wasn't the end of the battle. In fact, it was only the beginning. The corruption that had infected the justice system was vast, and there were powerful people who would do anything to protect their secrets. Weeks later, the retrial was set to take place. The courtroom was packed once again, but this time, the air was different. The tension was still there, but now it was filled with anticipation and hope. Ryan, though thinner and visibly aged from his time in prison, stood at the defense table. His face, once full of defiance, was now tempered with a quiet strength. Brewer watched as Ryan sat quietly, his eyes fixed ahead. The man who had once been condemned to 60 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit was now fighting for his freedom. As the presiding judge announced the decision to overturn Ryan's conviction, the room erupted in applause and tears. Ryan stood, his hands trembling as his mother rushed to embrace him. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Ryan, once a symbol of injustice, was now free. But for Brewer, the victory was bittersweet. He had been part of something larger than himself, something that had changed the course of Ryan's life and exposed the rot within the system. The case had sparked a nationwide conversation about police corruption and the need for reform. But the battle for justice was far from over. Brewer knew that there was still much work to be done to heal the system and to ensure that no more innocent lives were destroyed by the same failures. In the days that followed the retrial, the fallout from the case spread far and wide. Detective Lewis was arrested and faced criminal charges for his role in framing Ryan Hale. An independent investigation into the Fresno Police Department revealed a culture of corruption that had been allowed to flourish for years. The case became a rallying cry for accountability and reform within the justice system. For Judge Brewer, the battle for justice wasn't over. He remained steadfast in his commitment to exposing corruption and fighting for reform. He knew that this case was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, but it was a start, and he was determined to spend the rest of his career working toward a more just and transparent system. As for Ryan, his journey had only just begun. Freed from the burden of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story became a symbol of hope and resilience, showing the world that even in the darkest of times, the truth would eventually prevail. The story of Ryan Hale and Judge Malcolm Brewer serves as a powerful reminder that justice is not infallible. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. Sometimes it begins there. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations that work to free the wrongfully convicted and advocate for systemic reform. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom, it begins there.